Hello, and welcome to Creepy Raindrops. Before you drift off to sleep, let me tell you a story. A story that will help you relax and fall into a deep, peaceful slumber. Sit or lie down comfortably, and let the world around you slowly fade away. Tonight, I will take you on a journey through the woods, where the air is cool and the shadows of the trees stretch long. As you listen, let your mind relax, your body feel heavy, and all the noise in your head gradually fade away. Before we begin, I'd like to know, which city are you listening to this story from? And what time is it there? The secret inside the walls. In the fall of 2019, in the quiet coastal town of Mendocino, California, a young woman named Harper Nolan inherited her late grandmother's Victorian house. The house stood on a cliff overlooking the Pacific Ocean, surrounded by tall, swaying cypress trees. The locals always spoke of the home with hushed voices, referring to it as the Echo House, because of the strange noises that were said to come from its walls. Harper, a freelance photographer in her late 20s, had always loved her grandmother's stories about the house when she was younger. But when she stepped into the place after nearly a decade, it felt different. The air was cold, heavier than she remembered. The faded wallpaper in the dimly lit hallways seemed to ripple slightly, as though it had a life of its own. The first few nights were uneventful, save for the occasional creaks of the old wooden floorboards. Harper chalked it up to the age of the house and the coastal winds. But on the third night, as she sat editing photos in the kitchen, she heard a faint tapping sound coming from the dining room. It was rhythmic, deliberate. She froze, her fingers hovering above her keyboard. "Hello," she called out, her voice echoing faintly. The tapping stopped. Curious but slightly unnerved, Harper grabbed her flashlight and moved cautiously toward the dining room. She shone the beam across the room, revealing nothing but antique furniture cloaked in dust and shadows. But then she noticed something strange. The far wall, the one facing the cliffside, had an odd crack running down its center. The crack hadn't been there earlier that day. The following morning, Harper decided to investigate further. She pulled out the old blueprints of the house that her grandmother had left behind. Strangely, they didn't match the layout of the current house. The blueprints showed an additional room behind the dining room wall, a room that didn't exist anymore. Driven by curiosity, Harper called her childhood friend Ethan, a contractor who lived nearby. Ethan arrived that afternoon, carrying his toolbox and wearing a skeptical grin. "This house is old," he said, inspecting the wall. "Cracks like that happen all the time. Probably just the foundation settling." But Harper wasn't convinced. She insisted Ethan take a closer look. As he tapped the wall with his knuckles, the hollow sound it produced made his grin fade. "This wall, it's not solid," Ethan muttered, frowning. "It's covering something." Excitement mixed with dread surged through Harper as Ethan fetched a crowbar. With each pull and crack of the plaster, the room seemed to grow colder. Finally, a small section of the wall gave way, revealing a dark, narrow space beyond it. "What the hell is this?" Ethan murmured, aiming his flashlight into the gap. The beam illuminated what appeared to be a small, hidden room. Inside, there was a single wooden chair facing the wall, and strange symbols etched into the floor. Dust coated everything, but there was no sign of cobwebs, as if the room had been sealed recently. Harper stepped closer, her breath visible in the now freezing air. She felt an overwhelming sense of unease, like she was being watched. And then they heard it, a low, guttural whisper. It didn't come from the hidden room. It came from the walls behind them. Harper froze, her flashlight trembling in her grip. Ethan turned slowly, his face pale, his mouth slightly agape. The whisper was faint but unmistakable, a deep, guttural sound that seemed to shift in tone, like it was trying to form words. "What was that?" Ethan asked, his voice barely above a whisper. Harper shook her head, unable to speak. Her instinct screamed at her to leave the house immediately, but her feet felt rooted to the floor. The whisper came again, this time louder, resonating through the walls like the hum of an old, unseen machine. Ethan broke the silence, grabbing Harper's arm. "We need to go. Now." Harper hesitated. She wanted to know more, needed to know more. But the fear in Ethan's eyes was contagious, and the oppressive cold in the air made it hard to think clearly. She nodded reluctantly, and they both hurried out of the dining room, leaving the hidden gap in the wall exposed. Once outside, the fresh air hit Harper like a wave, but it didn't bring her any comfort. The house loomed behind her, its tall windows like dark, unblinking eyes. Ethan lit a cigarette with shaky hands, pacing in the driveway. "What the hell is going on in there, Harper? That room, those symbols, and that sound. It's not normal." Harper crossed her arms, trying to steady her breathing. "It's the house. It's always been strange, even when I was a kid. My grandma used to talk about it, but I thought she was just being dramatic." Ethan exhaled a cloud of smoke, his face tense. "Dramatic doesn't cover it. That wall wasn't just hiding a room. It was hiding something someone didn't want anyone to find." Harper's curiosity began to override her fear. She pulled out her phone, scrolling through old messages from her grandmother. One sent a few months before her death caught her attention. "The house keeps its secrets, Harper, but not all of them are meant to be found. Be careful." She read the message aloud to Ethan, who threw his cigarette to the ground and crushed it under his boot. "That's cryptic as hell," he muttered. Harper looked back at the house. The late afternoon sun cast long shadows across the front yard, making the windows look even darker. She thought about the crack in the wall, the hollow sound, the hidden room, and the whisper. "I need to go back in," she said suddenly. Ethan stared at her like she'd lost her mind. "Are you serious? Did you not hear what I heard? Whatever's in there, it doesn't want us around." "That's exactly why I have to go back," Harper insisted. "What if my grandmother knew about this? What if this is why she never wanted to leave the house? I can't just ignore it." Ethan ran a hand through his hair, clearly torn. "Fine," he said reluctantly. "But if we're going back in, we're doing it right. I'll grab some equipment from my truck." Harper nodded, her heart pounding as she followed Ethan to his truck. He rummaged through a toolbox, pulling out a heavy-duty flashlight, a crowbar, and a pair of gloves. "If anything feels off, we're out of there," he said firmly. They re-entered the house, the door creaking ominously as it swung open. The interior felt even colder than before, and the silence was deafening. They made their way back to the dining room, where the gap in the wall still revealed the hidden room. Ethan shone his flashlight inside again. The symbols on the floor seemed to shimmer faintly in the beam, as though they were etched with some kind of reflective material. Harper stepped closer, her curiosity growing despite the unease that twisted in her stomach. "Look at this," Ethan said, crouching near the edge of the gap. He pointed to the symbols. "These aren't just random carvings. They're deliberate, ritualistic." Harper frowned. "You think someone performed rituals in there?" Ethan nodded slowly. "It's possible. I've seen stuff like this in old buildings before, usually nothing good. As they studied the symbols, the whisper came again, louder this time. It echoed through the walls, sounding closer, more insistent. Harper and Ethan both jumped, their flashlights flickering briefly. "Okay, that's it," Ethan said, standing up. "We need to..." Before he could finish, the floor beneath them groaned loudly, as if something heavy had shifted below. "What was that?" Harper asked, her voice trembling. Ethan pointed his flashlight toward the floorboards. The sound came again, a deep, resonant creak, followed by a faint thumping noise. It was coming from beneath the dining room. "There's a basement," Harper whispered, the realization dawning on her. Ethan looked at her sharply. "Your grandma's house has a basement? You didn't think to mention that." "I didn't know," Harper replied defensively. "I've never been down there. I don't even know how to get to it." They scanned the room, searching for any sign of a trapdoor or staircase. After several minutes, Ethan's flashlight revealed a small, nearly invisible seam in the floorboards near the corner of the room. "Here," he said, crouching down and using the crowbar to pry the boards loose. Beneath them was a dark, narrow staircase that descended into the unknown. The air that wafted up from the opening was damp and heavy, carrying a faint, metallic smell. Harper hesitated, but Ethan had already begun descending, his flashlight cutting through the darkness. "Come on," he called up to her, his voice echoing faintly. Harper swallowed her fear and followed him down. The stairs creaked under her weight, and the walls seemed to close in as they descended. At the bottom of the stairs, they found themselves in a small, stone-walled cellar. The room was colder than anywhere else in the house, and the faint smell of rust was stronger here. In the center of the room stood an old wooden table, its surface covered with dust and what looked like dried candle wax. But it was what hung on the walls that made Harper's breath catch. Photographs, hundreds of black and white photographs, pinned haphazardly to the stone walls. Each one depicted a person, some smiling, some staring blankly at the camera, and some with expressions of sheer terror. "What the hell is this?" Ethan whispered, his flashlight moving from photo to photo. Harper stepped closer, her eyes scanning the images. Many of the faces were unfamiliar, but one photo stopped her cold. It was a picture of her grandmother younger, her face serene as she stood in front of the same Victorian house. "I don't understand," Harper said, her voice shaking. "Why are these here?" Before Ethan could answer, the whisper came again, this time louder than ever, reverberating through the cellar like a growl. And then the lights went out. The sudden darkness enveloped them. Harper's heart hammered in her chest, her breath quick and shallow as she fumbled for her flashlight. She could hear Ethan's footsteps shifting as he, too, tried to find his bearings in the pitch black of the cellar. The whisper grew louder, almost like a chant, echoing off the stone walls, and it seemed to come from all around them. "Ethan?" Harper's voice barely carried over the oppressive silence, her words lost in the low hum that filled the space. I don't know," Ethan's voice cracked, just as shaken. His flashlight flickered to life for a moment before dying again, leaving them in total darkness once more. Harper stumbled back, her hands grazing the rough stone wall as she tried to steady herself. She could feel the air grow colder around her, colder than she thought possible. The temperature dropped so fast that it hurt to breathe. The whispering stopped, but something else emerged from the silence. Footsteps, slow, methodical, approaching them from the shadows. They weren't the same as Ethan's or her own. These were heavier, dragging with each step, as if something large and slow were moving toward them. Harper froze, her blood running cold. Every instinct told her to run, to escape, but she couldn't. Her legs refused to move. Her body was rooted in place, paralyzed by fear. Then, the footsteps stopped. Ethan swore softly, his voice barely audible, just as the flashlight clicked back on. The beam cut through the darkness, weak and unsteady, but it illuminated something strange. At the far end of the cellar, standing before the wall of photographs, was a figure. The figure was tall, its features obscured by a long cloak or robe that seemed to absorb the light around it, making it hard to distinguish. Harper's eyes locked onto the dark shape, her breath caught in her throat. The figure didn't move. It simply stood there, facing the photographs. "Is that..." Harper started, but her voice faltered. She couldn't bring herself to finish the sentence. Ethan's flashlight shook in his hand, and he whispered hoarsely, No, that can't be real." Harper wanted to speak, to ask what they should do, but the words caught in her throat. The figure remained still, almost unnervingly so, as if it had been waiting for them to find it. She could feel its presence, like an oppressive weight pressing down on her chest. The whispering started again, but this time it was clearer, distinct. Words formed from the unintelligible hum. "Return what is mine." The voice was deep, guttural, like something ancient and forgotten. It wasn't a sound that belonged to the modern world, something that didn't belong in their time. It seemed to resonate from deep within the earth itself. Harper instinctively took a step back, her pulse racing as her hand reached for Ethan's arm. The figure did not react, not even acknowledging their presence. The cold grew unbearable, and Harper could feel a chilling wave of dread wash over her. She had heard about hauntings, but this felt like something far worse. Suddenly, the figure moved, its head turning slightly toward them. The movement was jerky, unnatural, like a puppet being controlled by invisible strings. The cloak billowed slightly, and for a fleeting moment, Harper thought she saw something beneath it. Eyes, gleaming with a terrible hunger. It spoke again, and this time, the voice was unmistakable. "Your grandmother knew. She knew the price of the secrets inside these walls." Harper's stomach churned. "My grandmother," she whispered, horrified. The figure stepped forward, slowly, with a dragging motion, like something too heavy for its own body. As it moved, the air grew colder still, and the very ground beneath their feet seemed to groan with tension. Harper wanted to scream, to run, but she was rooted to the spot, her legs unwilling to obey her commands. The figure raised its hand, its skeletal fingers long and twisted. The air shifted as if it were pulling the light from the room. The walls seemed to pulse with a low, rhythmic beat, like a heart beating in the distance. The walls themselves alive, with an unnatural energy. "Do you understand?" the figure rasped. "You must pay the price. The price for disturbing the secrets." Harper's eyes widened as she looked at the wall of photographs, and for a split second, she thought she saw a familiar face among the many images. It was her grandmother, young, smiling, standing next to an unfamiliar man. But her grandmother's face wasn't the only one that caught her attention. There were others, each of them with eyes wide in terror, their faces twisted in agony. Harper's heart sank as she realized the truth. The photographs were not just memories. They were warnings. The figure's head tilted slightly, and it spoke again. "It's too late now. The door is open, At that moment, the air seemed to vibrate with an immense, otherworldly force. The walls of the cellar groaned, and a heavy thudding sound began from somewhere deep within the earth beneath them. Harper instinctively grabbed Ethan's arm, pulling him toward the staircase. But as they moved, the lights flickered again, and the figure seemed to fade, its shape dissipating into the shadows. Yet, the oppressive sense of its presence lingered, filling the room like a thick fog. "We need to leave. Now," Harper shouted, her voice rising in panic. Ethan didn't hesitate. He turned, sprinting up the stairs with Harper close behind him, the strange, dragging footsteps echoing in the distance, as if something was following them. They reached the top of the stairs, gasping for breath, but when they looked back, the cellar door slammed shut with a deafening crash. The house was silent once more. Both of them stood in the hallway, trembling from head to toe, their minds racing to comprehend what had just happened. But they knew deep down that whatever had happened in that cellar, it wasn't over. The house had been hiding something ancient and dark, and it was now awake. "What the hell was that thing?" Ethan's voice was shaky. "I don't know," Harper replied, her voice barely above a whisper. "But it knows something about my grandmother, about the house." They stood there, staring at the closed door, unsure of what to do next. Harper's mind raced with questions that had no answers. The only thing she knew for certain was that she couldn't leave. Not yet. There was something about the house, something tied to her grandmother, that she needed to uncover. But just as she turned to face the stairs, ready to investigate further, the door at the end of the hallway creaked open by itself. The whisper returned. It was louder now, stronger. "You should have never come back." The voice echoed through the hallways, like the sound of many voices speaking in unison, a cacophony of whispers that shook the walls. Harper felt a cold shiver run down her spine as she took a hesitant step forward, drawn to the doorway. Ethan grabbed her arm. "No, don't. We don't know what we're dealing with." But Harper shook her head, her resolve hardening. "I have to know. I have to understand." Ethan stood still for a moment, torn, before following her down the hall. They moved cautiously toward the open door, the air growing colder with each step. When they reached the doorway, they both stopped, their breath catching in their throats. The room beyond was not a room they recognized. It was small, with stone walls, and at the center stood an altar, an old, weathered stone slab covered in ancient symbols. But what truly struck them was the figure that knelt before the altar. It was their grandmother, but she was not the same as they remembered. Her skin was pale, almost translucent, and her eyes were wide, staring blankly ahead as if in a trance. "Grandma," Harper whispered, stepping forward. The woman did not react. Her body seemed frozen in place, as if held by an invisible force. A low, rumbling voice filled the room. She made her choice. Harper took a step back, her heart racing. She felt an overwhelming chill seep through her bones as she stared at her grandmother, who was kneeling before the altar. The woman before her looked like the grandmother she remembered, but there was something deeply wrong with her. Something unnatural in the way her body was held motionless, her eyes vacant and unseeing. The air was thick, heavy with the weight of something ancient and sinister. "Grandma," Harper whispered again, louder this time, her voice shaking. She took another step forward, but Ethan grabbed her arm with a firm grip, pulling her back. His face was pale, his eyes wide with fear. "You can't," he said softly, though his voice was strained. That's not her anymore. Harper turned to face Ethan, her brow furrowed in confusion. What do you mean? This is my grandmother. Her voice cracked, the fear in her words betraying her disbelief. Why is she here like this? What happened to her? Ethan's gaze never left the kneeling figure. His hands were shaking, and he looked as though he were about to say something, but the words wouldn't come. He swallowed hard, and for a moment, it seemed like he was searching for an explanation, something to make sense of the horror unfolding before them. Then, in a quiet, hesitant voice, he spoke again. She made a deal a long time ago. A deal with whatever the hell is in this house. And whatever it is, it doesn't let go easily. Harper shook her head, her mind struggling to grasp the enormity of what Ethan was saying. No, she whispered. That can't be true. My grandmother would never. But as she said it, she remembered all the cryptic warnings her grandmother had given her over the years, the things she had said about the house. Harper had dismissed them at the time as nothing more than strange old tales, relics of a time long gone. But now, standing in this room with the altar and the figure of her grandmother frozen in place, those words felt like a cruel prophecy. Ethan's voice trembled as he continued. She didn't have a choice, Harper. This house, it has a way of pulling people in, making them do things they don't understand. When she came here, when she moved in, she made an agreement. A price for staying. A price for whatever this is. Harper's eyes darted to the altar, and her breath caught in her throat as she took in the symbols etched into the stone. They were the same symbols that had been carved into the floor of the hidden room. The very same markings that had seemed so strange and out of place when she first saw them. But now, they felt different, darker, more menacing. What kind of deal? Harper asked, her voice barely a whisper, as if speaking too loudly might awaken something far worse. I don't know exactly, Ethan replied, his eyes flickering nervously toward the altar. But I've heard stories. People who get caught in this house, they either leave or they become a part of it. And the ones who stay, they're never really free. Harper's stomach churned as she looked at the woman who had raised her, the woman she had loved and admired. Her grandmother had always been so strong, so full of life. But now, she was nothing more than a hollow shell, kneeling before that altar, her eyes empty and distant. Harper felt tears sting the corners of her eyes. No, this can't be happening. The voice, that same low, rumbling sound, filled the room again. This time, it was louder, more pronounced, as if it were coming from everywhere and nowhere at once. It was a voice that seemed to reverberate in the very bones of the house, deep and resonant. You have come too late, it intoned, the words heavy with a terrifying finality. The choice has been made. She is mine now, and so are you. Harper's heart pounded in her chest, and for the first time, she felt a true sense of terror, something deeper than the fear of the unknown. It was the feeling of being trapped, of knowing there was no way out. The figure of her grandmother remained unmoving, her body rigid and lifeless as the voice continued. The house demands its payment, and you will give it. You will offer up your soul to join the others, or you will never leave. Harper took another step back, her mind racing. No, she whispered, shaking her head. I won't. I can't. Ethan pulled her toward him, his grip firm and urgent. We have to get out of here, Harper. It's too late. We're not strong enough to fight whatever this is. We have to leave, or we'll end up like her. But Harper couldn't tear her gaze away from her grandmother. Despite the horror of the situation, She couldn't leave. She had to know what happened, what had truly bound her grandmother to this place. Her grandmother had known something important, and it was that knowledge that had driven her to make the ultimate sacrifice. The sacrifice that had left her trapped in this house, bound to its darkness. Harper's eyes stung with unshed tears, but there was no time to cry. She needed answers. "Grandma," she said softly, stepping closer to the altar, her voice trembling. "What did you do? What happened to you?" There was a long pause, and for a moment, Harper thought she might have imagined the slight twitch in her grandmother's hand. But then, the woman's lips moved just barely, as if the very act of speaking required more effort than Harper could comprehend. "You must never leave." Her grandmother whispered, the words barely audible. "The house, it won't let you go. Once you know, once you understand, you can never escape." Harper's heart sank. She felt a strange pull, an undeniable urge to understand, to know more. Her grandmother's words rang in her ears as if they were a warning or a curse. "Please," Harper begged, her voice shaking with desperation. "Tell me what happened. What did you agree to?" But there was no answer. The silence stretched on, and then, suddenly, the room grew darker. The symbols on the altar glowed with an eerie light, their patterns shifting and changing as if they were alive, as if they were part of the house itself. The ground beneath them rumbled again, more violently this time, and the air grew thick with an oppressive pressure, like something was closing in around them. The whispering returned, louder and more frantic. "Leave, leave now." The figure of her grandmother slowly rose from the altar, her movements stiff and unnatural, as if she were being controlled by some invisible force. Her eyes remained blank, unfocused, but as she stood, Harper saw something else. A flicker of recognition, of something that wasn't quite her grandmother, but something else entirely, something that had taken her place. Ethan grabbed Harper's arm and pulled her back, his grip desperate now. "We need to go. Now, Harper. Before it's too late." Harper wanted to fight it, wanted to stay and learn the truth, but she could feel the weight of the house pressing down on her, the very walls closing in. The air seemed thick with the presence of something malevolent, something that didn't want them to leave. The figure of her grandmother took a step forward, her hand reaching out toward them. The glow of the symbols on the altar intensified, casting long, distorted shadows across the room. The ground rumbled again, more violently this time, and Harper could feel the house itself stirring, as though it were alive, waking up to claim them. Harper turned to Ethan, her eyes wide with terror. "We have to go now," she shouted. Ethan didn't need another prompt. He pulled her toward the door, his steps quick and frantic as they made their way back down the hallway. The whispering followed them, growing louder with every step. "Leave, leave. You cannot escape." As they reached the front door, Harper glanced back at the altar one last time. Her grandmother's figure was still standing there, but now the woman's eyes locked onto hers, a sad, knowing look in them. "I'm sorry, Harper," the woman whispered, her voice barely audible, "but you've already been chosen." The door slammed shut behind them, and for the first time in what felt like hours, they were outside, gasping for breath. The air was cold, sharp against their skin, but it was nothing compared to the suffocating darkness inside. Harper stumbled back, her heart pounding. She looked at the house, her mind spinning with the impossibility of everything she had just witnessed. The house loomed tall and foreboding behind her, its windows dark, as if waiting for them to return. But she knew deep down that she could never go back. Not unless she wanted to lose herself, too. And somewhere inside, deep within the walls of that cursed house, her grandmother's voice whispered one final time, "Don't come back." As Harper and Ethan stood outside, their breaths visible in the cold night air, the house loomed behind them, casting long shadows in the moonlight. The silence that surrounded them was deafening, broken only by the distant sounds of crickets and the occasional rustle of wind in the trees. It should have felt like relief. They were out. They had escaped the suffocating darkness of the house. But Harper couldn't shake the feeling that they weren't truly free. Every fiber of her being screamed that there was more to uncover, more to understand. Her grandmother's words echoed in her mind, her voice now forever intertwined with the sinister whispers from the depths of the house. "You've already been chosen." What did that mean? What had she meant? Ethan was already pacing back and forth, his footsteps quick and nervous. He seemed just as shaken as she was, but he wasn't as torn. He knew that leaving was the only option. Harper's heart ached, though. She knew that going back into that house meant facing something far worse. But how could she live with the uncertainty? How could she live with the thought that there were answers she might never find? Harper turned to Ethan, her voice quiet but urgent. "We can't just leave, Ethan. We need to understand what happened. We need to know why my grandmother was like that. We can't let it end like this." Ethan stopped pacing, his face etched with worry. "Harper, please," he said, his voice hoarse. "We can't go back there. That place, it's not just a house. It's something else. It's—" "I know," she interrupted, her voice almost pleading. "But if we leave now, we're never going to have answers. We'll just keep wondering forever. I need to know. I have to know what happened to her." Ethan stared at her, conflicted, his eyes flickering between the house and Harper's determined face. He knew she was right, that the questions would never go away, but he also knew the danger that lurked inside the walls of that house. It wasn't just a matter of curiosity, it was survival. The house was more than they could comprehend. Harper could see the moment he resigned himself to her decision. He exhaled sharply, his shoulders slumping with reluctant defeat. "Fine," he said, his voice barely above a whisper. "But if we do this, we do it together. No going off on your own. We stick together." "Understood." Harper nodded, her heart pounding. She could feel the weight of the decision settling over her, the gravity of it nearly suffocating. She wasn't sure what they would find in that house, but she knew she had to face it, if only to honor her grandmother, who had given up everything to protect a secret so dark that it could swallow them whole. They made their way back to the house, every step feeling like a weight pressing down on them. As they approached the door, the house seemed to stare back at them, its dark windows like eyes, watching them with an unsettling intensity. The door, which had slammed shut behind them earlier, now stood ajar, as if welcoming them back. "Are we sure about this?" Ethan asked, his voice low, almost fearful. His hand hovered near the door handle, but hesitated. Harper took a deep breath. "We don't have a choice. We have to know." With a firm grip on the doorknob, she pushed the door open. The creak of the old wood echoed through the silence of the house as they stepped inside. The air inside was thick and musty, the smell of decay lingering like a heavy blanket. The hallway was just as they had left it, but there was something different. The air felt heavier, charged with a palpable sense of dread, as if the house itself was aware of their return. Harper's pulse quickened, but she steeled herself. She couldn't let fear take hold now, not after everything she had seen. They moved cautiously through the house, the floorboards creaking under their feet with each step. The silence was oppressive, almost suffocating. The faint whispering from before had stopped, but Harper could still feel its presence. It was as if the house was watching them, waiting for them to make the next move. They reached the living room, and Harper felt her stomach churn as she noticed the same photographs on the walls. The same images of her grandmother, young and smiling, but now with a different, more sinister edge. The faces in the pictures seemed to follow them, their eyes shifting in the flickering light of the flashlight. It was like they were alive, watching, waiting. Where do we go from here? Ethan's voice broke through the silence, his words strained. He seemed just as uneasy as Harper, his eyes darting from one shadowed corner of the room to the next. Harper looked around, her mind racing. There was only one place left. The cellar. It was the only place that still held secrets. Secrets her grandmother had kept hidden for so long. The same cellar where Harper had first encountered that figure. The one that claimed to have known her grandmother. Harper knew that if they were going to find the answers they needed, it would be in that cursed room. They descended the stairs into the cellar, the same ones that had felt so terrifying before. The air grew colder with each step, the chill sinking deep into their bones. The whispers started again, faint but growing louder. Harper's breath caught in her throat as they reached the bottom of the stairs. The cellar was just as it had been before, dimly lit, with the stone walls and the rows of old, forgotten crates and boxes. But now the atmosphere was different. The air felt charged, crackling with a malevolent energy. The symbols on the floor were now glowing faintly, their edges shimmering as if they were alive. Harper's heart raced as she scanned the room. It was then that she saw it, the altar. It stood in the far corner, covered in dust and cobwebs, but unmistakable. The same altar her grandmother had knelt before. The same place where that dark figure had appeared. But there was something new, something that hadn't been there before. Atop the altar, there was a book. It was ancient, bound in leather, so dark it seemed to absorb the light around it. The pages were yellowed with age, the edges worn from use. It looked like the kind of book that had been hidden away for centuries, its secrets locked inside. Harper felt an overwhelming compulsion to approach it. It was as if the book itself was calling to her, beckoning her to unlock its contents. "Don't touch it," Ethan warned, his voice tight with fear. "That's what she was trying to protect, Harper. That book, it's the key to everything. The key to whatever this house is." But Harper didn't listen. She stepped forward, her hands trembling as she reached for the book. The moment her fingers brushed the cover, a surge of cold shot through her body. It was like a shock of electricity, sharp and painful, and for a split second, she thought she might pass out from the intensity of it. But the book didn't burn her. Instead, it seemed to welcome her touch, as if it had been waiting for her. With a deep breath, Harper opened the book. The pages crackled with age as she flipped through them. The language was strange, unlike anything she had ever seen before. Symbols and letters that didn't belong to any known alphabet. But as she stared at the pages, the meaning of the words seemed to seep into her mind, as if the book itself was imprinting them onto her consciousness. The more she read, the clearer it became. Her grandmother hadn't just been a victim of the house. She had made a choice, a terrible, irreversible choice. A choice to become part of the house itself, to become bound to its dark forces. The house had a way of drawing people in, of twisting them until they were no longer human. And once they were inside, there was no escape. The book spoke of rituals, of sacrifices made to feed the house's insatiable hunger. It spoke of deals struck in exchange for power, for immortality, for the preservation of one's soul. It explained the price of the deal, the toll it took on those who dared to enter its walls. And then Harper saw it, the final piece of the puzzle. Her grandmother's name was written in the book, along with a date, her date of death. But the thing that made Harper's blood run cold was the phrase written next to it. She has given all. Her soul is mine. The realization hit Harper like a slap in the face. Her grandmother hadn't been protecting them from the house. She had been protecting them from herself, from the monster she had become. The house had claimed her, and now it wanted Harper and Ethan. The realization struck Harper like a blow to the chest, stealing the air from her lungs. Her grandmother hadn't just made a deal with the house. She had become a part of it. The weight of this discovery felt like a suffocating fog, pressing down on her chest and clouding her mind. The book in her hands felt heavier now, its pages thick with the history of pain and despair that had unfolded in this house. Harper's fingers trembled as she turned another page, her eyes scanning the cryptic text. She had to understand. She had to know what the house wanted and why it had taken her grandmother. Ethan was standing behind her, his face pale and strained. He was watching her, his gaze flicking between the book and the room as if he feared something would leap out at any moment. His hands were clenched tightly by his sides, and Harper could feel his unease radiating off of him. Harper, Ethan whispered, his voice rough with fear. We should leave now. We can't stay here any longer. This place, it's not just haunted, it's cursed. Harper didn't look up. She couldn't. Every fiber of her being was consumed with the need to finish what she had started. Her grandmother had been trapped here, bound by the very thing Harper had walked into tonight, and now it was her turn. She could feel the house watching them, could feel the walls pressing in on them, urging them to leave, to escape before it was too late. But she wasn't ready to run, not yet. Ethan's words echoed in her mind, and for a moment, she considered listening to him. But then she thought of her grandmother, of how she had protected Harper for so long, of how she had tried to keep her safe. She owed it to her to understand, to make sure that this curse didn't consume anyone else. If there was a way to break it, to set her grandmother free, Harper had to find it. I can't, Harper murmured, her voice shaky. She forced her hands to keep turning the pages, even though the text seemed to swim before her eyes. The symbols, the words, they were starting to blur together in her mind, forming shapes that were almost recognizable, but too obscure to fully comprehend. It was as though the book itself was trying to shield its secrets from her. Harper, please. Ethan's voice cracked with desperation. You don't understand. This book, whatever it is, it's not meant for us. We don't know what we're dealing with here. It's too powerful. We're not equipped to fight it. If we stay, we'll become part of it, too. Harper's fingers tightened around the book, her nails digging into the fragile leather cover. Her heart pounded in her chest, and she could feel the weight of the house's eyes on her. She could feel it, the presence of something ancient and powerful, pushing against the walls of her mind. The house didn't want her to know. It didn't want her to understand. It wanted to claim her, just like it had claimed her grandmother. But she couldn't give in. Not now. Don't you see? Harper whispered, her voice raw with emotion. This is the key. This is how we can stop it. My grandmother was trying to protect me. She wanted to keep me safe from this. She gestured to the book, to the altar, to the house itself. But now I know. I have to finish it. I have to stop this before it's too late. The words hung heavy in the air, and for a moment, the only sound in the room was the crackling of the old pages turning beneath Harper's fingers. Then, as if responding to her determination, the room seemed to grow colder. The whispers started again, distant at first, but quickly gaining strength. They echoed off the stone walls, filling the room with a cacophony of voices, faint but undeniable. Harper. Ethan's voice was strained, almost pleading. I'm begging you. We can't fight this. You can't fight this. The house will take everything from us. It already took your grandmother. A chill ran down Harper's spine, but she refused to let the fear take hold. She had to find a way. There had to be something in the book, something that could help them. Her eyes scanned the pages faster now, desperate for anything that could give her a clue. The whispers grew louder, surrounding her, closing in from all sides. The words in the book seemed to shift, becoming clearer the more she read. The price has already been paid, she muttered to herself, reading aloud. The soul must be offered to bind the house. Those who enter may never leave unless the pact is broken. Harper's pulse quickened. She looked at Ethan, whose face had gone ashen. His eyes were wide with terror, and Harper could see the fear in them. He didn't understand what she was reading. He didn't understand what the words meant. But she did. She had to break the pact. There had to be a way to free her grandmother, to sever the connection between the house and the souls it had claimed. Harper, no, Ethan said, his voice barely audible now. Don't do it. You're reading it wrong. This isn't some fairy tale. This is real. This house, this place, it feeds on people. It consumes them, twists them into something else. Your grandmother, she was never the same after she made that deal. Harper shook her head, her mind racing as she tried to make sense of the text before her. The words seemed to flicker in and out of focus, and she felt the house's presence growing stronger. It was all around them now, suffocating, pushing in on them. The walls seemed to pulse with an unnatural energy, as if the house itself were alive, breathing with them. It wasn't just the whispers that filled the air now. It was the feeling of something darker, something ancient, stirring beneath the surface. Harper, stop. Ethan shouted, grabbing her arm and pulling her back from the altar. The book slipped from her fingers, falling to the ground with a heavy thud. But the moment it touched the floor, the room seemed to tremble. The ground beneath them rumbled, sending a jolt of panic through Harper's chest. The air thickened, and the whispering reached a crescendo, becoming a deafening roar that drowned out everything else. Harper stumbled back, her heart racing as the walls around them began to shift. The symbols on the altar flickered, glowing with an eerie light that cast long, unsettling shadows on the walls. The room seemed to bend and twist, warping in on itself, as if the very fabric of reality was coming undone. Ethan's grip tightened on her arm, pulling her toward the stairs. We have to get out of here, he urged, his voice filled with panic. Now, this isn't just a house anymore. It's alive, and it's coming for us. Harper fought against his pull, her mind still racing with the need to understand, to break the curse. No, we can't just run. We have to finish this. But as she spoke, the temperature in the room plummeted. Her breath came out in sharp, visible bursts, and her vision began to blur. She could feel it now, the dark energy in the air, thick and suffocating, pressing in on them from all sides. It wasn't just the house anymore. It was something far worse, something that had been waiting for them. Suddenly, there was a crash from behind them. Harper turned just in time to see the altar shake violently, the book that had fallen to the floor now glowing with a fiery, unnatural light. The whispers rose to a deafening crescendo, filling the air with a voice that was not human. "You should never have returned," the voice boomed, its tone harsh and mocking. "You are too late." The ground shook beneath their feet, sending Harper sprawling to the floor. The house seemed to come alive, the walls pulsing, bending inward as if it were closing in on them. She could feel the weight of the house pressing on her, trying to pull her in, to claim her, just like it had claimed her grandmother. Ethan was tugging at her arm, shouting her name, but the house was already pulling them apart. The room was disintegrating around them, the walls crumbling, the floor cracking open, as if the very foundation of the house was being ripped apart. "Harper!" Ethan screamed, his face wild with fear. Harper tried to reach for him, but she could barely move. The darkness was swallowing her whole, and she could hear the whispers growing louder, more insistent, until they were the only thing she could hear. They were everywhere, inside her head, inside her bones. "You belong to us now," the voice of the house said. "You are ours, forever." And as the darkness closed in, Harper understood the truth. There was no escaping this house. There was no escape from the curse her grandmother had so willingly embraced. The house had already claimed them both, and now there was no way out. The darkness around them deepened, a living, suffocating thing. Harper could feel it wrapping around her, coiling like tendrils around her body, pulling her deeper into its fold. The walls were no longer just walls. They seemed to breathe, to shift, like they were part of some ancient, malevolent organism that had waited centuries for the right moment to strike. Every shadow felt like it was watching, like it was waiting for them to make the wrong move, and in that moment, Harper realized that they had already made that mistake. She could hear Ethan's voice again, though it was distant now, faint as though coming from the farthest reaches of her consciousness. His hands were still gripping her arm, but the pressure was no longer comforting. It was desperate, like a man drowning, reaching for a lifeline he knew wouldn't save him. Harper's breath came in ragged bursts as she fought against the oppressive energy that seemed to seep from every crack in the house. Her body was shaking, but not from cold. It was something much worse, an all-consuming fear, the kind that paralyzed you, made your body feel foreign to you, like you were no longer in control. "Harper." Ethan's voice was urgent now, and she felt the tug of his grip as he tried to pull her toward the stairs. But it was useless. No matter how hard they tried, the house was not letting them go. "Let me go," Harper cried, her voice raw, her throat tight. "We have to finish this. We have to." But before she could finish her sentence, the ground beneath them lurched violently. The walls seemed to pulse in response, and a deep, guttural growl reverberated through the floor, like the house itself was waking up from a long slumber. Harper stumbled, her vision blurring as her legs gave way beneath her, and she fell hard to the floor. Ethan cursed as he tried to catch her, but the force of the tremor sent him crashing into the wall. The world seemed to warp around her. Her head spun, her mind struggling to grasp the enormity of what was happening. The whispers, the voices, were louder now, filling every inch of the room, crawling beneath her skin, whispering words she couldn't understand. but the fear in them was unmistakable. Ethan was back on his feet, reaching for her again, but something stopped him. A shadow, darker than the rest, moved in front of him, its form flickering like smoke, its shape shifting in the dim light. It was only for a moment, but in that moment, Harper saw it clearly. A figure, tall and twisted, its face obscured by the darkness. But the eyes were glowing, red, glowing eyes that burned through the shadows, locking onto her. A cold, unnatural chill washed over her, and Harper froze. She knew deep down that this was no ordinary spirit, no lingering presence of someone who had once lived. This was something far worse, something that existed beyond the realm of the living. Harper moved. Ethan shouted, panic in his voice, but it was too late. The figure advanced toward them, its presence pushing against the very air. Harper could feel her heart pounding in her chest, her breath shallow and uneven. She wanted to run, wanted to escape, but the room had changed. The walls weren't just walls anymore. They had become something else entirely. The room itself seemed to twist, to bend, pulling them deeper into the house's heart. The figure stopped in front of her, and Harper could feel the weight of its gaze pressing down on her. The air grew thick, as if something ancient and terrible was settling over her, suffocating her. "You cannot leave," a voice rasped, coming from the figure, its tone low and cruel. The voice seemed to come from everywhere and nowhere all at once, reverberating through the walls, the floor, the air itself. "You are already ours." Harper's pulse raced. She was trapped. There was no escape. She felt Ethan's presence beside her, but it felt distant, disconnected. The figure's eyes were fixed on her, unblinking, and she knew that whatever this was, whatever force had taken hold of the house, it had been waiting for her to come back. "Why me?" she gasped, her voice barely a whisper. "What do you want from me?" The figure didn't answer immediately. Instead, it tilted its head, as if contemplating her question. Then it spoke again, its voice even colder this time, dripping with malice. "You are the final piece," it said, its words reverberating in Harper's bones. "Your grandmother was a part of the bargain, but you are the one who will complete it." The house seemed to pulse again, and Harper could feel the ground trembling beneath her. The walls were closing in, narrowing around them, and the space between them and the exit was shrinking, as if the house were pressing them into a corner. She could hear Ethan's breath quickening beside her, but his presence was fading, lost in the overwhelming power of the dark entity before them. "Your grandmother," the figure continued, its voice dragging like a rusted chain across her skin. "She made her choice long ago. She knew the price, but she couldn't stop. Neither can you." Harper's mind raced, trying to make sense of the words, but the weight of the situation was crushing her, clouding her thoughts. Her grandmother had known. She had known the price, and yet she had still made the deal. Harper's heart twisted in her chest as the realization dawned on her. Her grandmother hadn't just protected her from the house, she had protected her from herself. But now it was too late. The figure extended its hand, and the room seemed to grow colder still. The shadows moved with purpose, swirling around Harper and Ethan, closing in on them, leaving no room for escape. Ethan took a step forward, reaching for Harper, but the figure's presence stopped him in his tracks. A low, guttural growl filled the air, and the shadows around them deepened, thickening like ink spilling across the walls. "You have no power here," the figure hissed. "No power to change anything." Harper swallowed hard. her mind spinning with everything she had learned. The book, the pact, her grandmother, it was all connected. This house, this dark entity, it had been feeding on souls for centuries, using promises of power, immortality, and protection to trap its victims. And now it had come for her. But as the figure's hand moved toward her, something inside Harper clicked. It was as if a switch had been flipped in her mind, a long-forgotten instinct stirring deep within her. She had to break the cycle. She had to end this, no matter the cost. "Stop," Harper shouted, her voice louder than it had ever been. The words came from somewhere deep inside her, a surge of strength she didn't know she had. "I won't let you have me." The figure faltered, its glowing eyes flickering with something like surprise, but it quickly recovered. "You cannot fight what you are destined for." But Harper wasn't listening anymore. She felt the power of the house, the dark energy that had been building around her, and she knew what she had to do. It wasn't just about surviving. It wasn't just about escaping. It was about breaking the curse, severing the connection once and for all. With a deep breath, Harper reached for the book, the one that had brought them here. It had to hold the key. She could feel the book's power pulsing beneath her fingers as she opened it once more, her eyes scanning the pages with newfound clarity. The words were still foreign, but they no longer held the same mystery. The power in the room shifted, and Harper knew that the house was trying to stop her. The walls trembled, the shadows closing in, but she wouldn't be swayed. "Come on, Harper, we have to go." Ethan shouted, but his voice was distant. He was lost in the power of the house, just as she had been. Harper's heart raced as she read the words aloud, her voice steady despite the terror gripping her. "By the blood of the fallen, by the will of the broken, by the fire that binds the soul, release this place from its curse." The air around her crackled, and the house screamed. The shadows twisted violently, spiraling toward her, but Harper stood firm. She could feel the power surging through her, and for the first time, she wasn't afraid. The house was alive, but it could be undone. The curse could be broken. With a final, forceful utterance, the book snapped shut, and the world around her shattered. The walls groaned, the shadows screamed, and the darkness was torn away. And then silence. The silence that followed the closing of the book was deafening. It wrapped itself around Harper and Ethan like a heavy blanket, smothering them in its thick, suffocating embrace. The oppressive energy that had filled the house moments before was gone, replaced by a stillness that felt unnatural. It was as if time itself had momentarily stopped, the air suspended, waiting for something, waiting for them to breathe, to move, to react. Harper could feel her heart pounding in her chest, but even that sound seemed muted, distant, as if it were happening far away. She stared at the book in her hands, her fingers still trembling from the power that had surged through her when she had spoken the words of release. The weight of the house, the shadows, the presence that had watched over them, it was all gone. But was it really over? She slowly lifted her eyes to the room around them, her gaze flicking from the altar to the walls, the floor, and the ceiling. The house, once alive with dark energy, now felt like a hollow shell. It was still there, but it was empty, drained, as though the life force that had sustained it for centuries had been ripped out, leaving only an echo of its former self. Ethan was standing next to her, his hands still gripping her arm. His face was pale, his eyes wide, filled with a mixture of relief and disbelief. He was breathing heavily, and Harper could see that his hands were shaking. She knew that he had felt the same weight of fear that had gripped her, and yet now, in the aftermath, they were both standing in the wreckage of what had once been a prison of darkness. "Did we?" Ethan whispered, his voice barely audible. "Did it work? Are we free?" Harper swallowed hard, her throat dry as dust. She glanced down at the book again, her fingers still lingering on the cover. It felt colder now, lifeless, but that didn't mean it was harmless. She knew the house. She knew that it didn't give up its grip so easily. It had twisted the lives of everyone who had crossed its threshold. And for a moment, she wondered if she, too, had become just another piece in its twisted game. She wasn't sure what the answer was, but something deep inside her, some instinct she couldn't explain, told her that the battle wasn't over. The house may have been silenced, but it wasn't truly gone. "No," Harper whispered, shaking her head. "It's not over. We haven't won. Not yet." Ethan looked at her, confusion clouding his features. "What are you talking about?" "It's silent. The house, it's gone." Harper turned to face him, her eyes searching his face, trying to find the words to explain what she was feeling, what she knew. "It's not gone, Ethan. It's waiting. It wants us to think it's gone, but it's still here. We didn't destroy it. We just freed it from its prison. We set it free, but that doesn't mean it won't come back." Ethan's expression darkened as the weight of her words sank in. "Then what are we supposed to do, if it's still here?" "I don't know," Harper admitted, her voice barely above a whisper. "But I know one thing. It's not just going to let us walk away. Not like this." As if on cue, the air in the room shifted. A faint hum, barely perceptible at first, began to reverberate through the walls. The sound was low and constant, like a faraway engine running, its vibrations creeping into their bones. The shadows, though no longer dark and oppressive, began to stretch across the floor, creeping toward them as if searching for something. "Harper, what is that?" Ethan asked, his voice tight with fear. Harper's eyes widened as the hum grew louder, the vibrations intensifying until the floor beneath them trembled. She felt it then, the shift, the pull of the house once more. It was as though the very foundation of the place had awakened, its pulse quickening, its life returning. The house was alive again. "I told you," Harper murmured, backing away from the altar. "It's not over." The walls groaned, a deep, resonant sound that seemed to echo from the very bones of the house. The shadows twisted, spiraling upward toward the ceiling, forming shapes, figures distorted and grotesque, as though the house itself was birthing something from the depths of its darkness. A figure appeared at the far end of the room, its outline flickering like a candle in the wind. For a moment, Harper thought it was just another hallucination, another trick of the house. But as the figure stepped forward, it became clearer. It was a woman, a tall, thin figure with long, dark hair that hung like a shroud around her face. Her eyes were empty, hollowed-out sockets that stared out into nothingness. Harper froze, her heart hammering in her chest. The figure was no illusion. It was real. "Who are you?" Harper asked, her voice shaking as she tried to keep her fear at bay. The woman did not answer, but her presence was unmistakable. She moved closer, the shadows shifting around her like a cloak, and Harper could feel the coldness radiating off of her. The temperature in the room plummeted, and Harper's breath turned to mist in the air. "She's here," Ethan whispered, his voice trembling. "Harper, this isn't over. It's her. It's your grandmother." Harper's blood ran cold at his words. But the figure in front of them wasn't her grandmother. She could feel it. The energy coming off of her was wrong. Twisted, dark, corrupted. This wasn't a person. This was something that had taken her grandmother's form. Something that had consumed her. The woman's head tilted slightly, as if studying them. Then, in a voice that was not her grandmother's, the figure spoke. "You think you can break the curse," it said, its voice a harsh, unnatural rasp. "You think you can end what has already begun. But you are wrong. The house is not just a place. It is a living thing. And once it chooses you, it does not let go." Harper's breath caught in her throat. "What do you want from us? Why are you here?" The woman's lips curled into a twisted smile, one that was both haunting and empty. "I am not here for you, child," she said, her voice low and mocking. "You are not the one I seek." The figure reached out toward Harper, its hand stretching toward her, long fingers curled like claws. The shadows writhed around it, and Harper could feel the air thickening, pressing against her. She tried to move, to back away, but her body wouldn't obey. She was frozen, held captive by the figure's gaze, by the power emanating from her. "You are nothing," the woman hissed, her voice taking on a more feral edge. "You are a part of the house now. You will never leave. No one ever does." Harper's heart raced as the figure drew closer, the shadows closing in around her, suffocating her. She could feel the coldness in the air, the grip of the house's power tightening around her throat. The darkness was consuming her, drowning her in its malevolent force. But then, as the woman reached out to touch her, something shifted within Harper. It was subtle at first, just a flicker of resistance, a flash of awareness. But it was enough. Something deep inside her, something she had inherited from her grandmother, sparked to life. She wasn't helpless. She wasn't a victim. "Get away from me," Harper screamed, her voice raw with fury, her hands trembling as she reached out to push the woman away. The force of her words rippled through the air, and for a brief moment, the figure hesitated. But it was enough. Harper felt the darkness falter, the shadows recoiling at her command. "You cannot control it," the woman snarled. But Harper could hear the tremor of doubt in her voice. "I can," Harper whispered, her hands shaking. But she stood tall, pushing against the force that had held her captive for so long. "I won't let you take me." The figure hesitated once more, and in that moment Harper knew she wasn't just fighting for herself. She was fighting for her grandmother, for everyone who had been consumed by this cursed house. She was fighting to end the nightmare once and for all. With every ounce of strength she had left, Harper focused on the dark energy surrounding her, commanding it to break, to shatter. And as the words tumbled from her lips, the house itself seemed to groan in response, the very walls trembling with the force of her will. The figure screamed in rage, its form flickering, warping, as if it were being torn apart. The shadows around Harper twisted and writhed, but she stood her ground. She would not give in. Not now. The house screamed one final time as the energy that had held it together shattered, and everything went silent. Harper stood still in the center of the room, her breath shallow and ragged. The oppressive atmosphere that had consumed the house moments before had dissipated. But in its place, there was an eerie silence that seemed to stretch on forever. Her heart pounded in her chest, each beat echoing in her ears as she looked around, still unsure if she was truly free. The shadows had vanished, the figures gone, but the air still felt thick with something unexplainable. There was a lingering sense of foreboding, a deep unease that refused to lift entirely. Harper swallowed hard, her fingers clutching the book in her hands, which felt strangely heavier now, as though it had absorbed something from the house, a power, a curse, or perhaps just the weight of the history it carried. Ethan stood beside her, his face pale, his eyes wide as he took in the scene. His voice was almost a whisper when he spoke. "Is it over? Really over?" Harper turned her gaze toward him. She wanted to reassure him, to say that it was done, that they had broken the cycle. But something in the pit of her stomach told her otherwise. She wasn't ready to call it over, not yet. She had learned that in this house, in this cursed place, nothing was ever truly finished. "I don't know," she admitted, her voice shaking. "It feels like it, but I don't trust it. Not yet." Ethan's brow furrowed, his lips pressing together in a tight line. He could sense her uncertainty, the way her body was still on edge, tense, as though waiting for something to happen. "Then what do we do?" he asked, his voice laced with desperation. "What do we need to do to get out of here?" Harper paused, glancing down at the book once more. The answers weren't clear, not yet. But the one thing she knew for certain was that they couldn't just walk away. The house had been built on lies, on secrets, and if they left now, they would be leaving it unfinished. She wasn't sure what the house would do if they simply walked out. The curse had roots that ran deep, and she had a sinking feeling that the house wouldn't let them go that easily. "There's something we missed," she muttered, more to herself than to Ethan. "Something we didn't uncover. I can feel it." Ethan didn't respond immediately, but Harper could feel the tension in the air as he watched her. He was scared. They both were. But they couldn't afford to give in to fear. They had to be smarter than the house, smarter than whatever dark force had claimed it as its own. "Maybe we should leave," Ethan suggested hesitantly. "Get as far away from this place as we can. It feels like we've done what we needed to do." Harper shook her head, her eyes narrowing. "We can't. Not yet." The words hung in the air between them, thick with unspoken fear. Harper could feel the weight of the decision she had just made. She wasn't sure if it was the right one, but deep down, she knew she couldn't walk away. She couldn't leave the house like this, not without knowing that it was truly over. The energy here was still alive, still shifting. She could sense it, just beneath the surface, like a whisper in the back of her mind. "I'm going to find out what we missed," Harper said, her voice steady, though her insides were anything but. I'm not leaving until I know for sure." Ethan looked at her, his eyes filled with concern, but there was a flicker of understanding in them too. He didn't want to leave her here alone, but he also knew that they had already been through too much to back down now. "All right," he said reluctantly. "I'm with you, but we need to be careful. I don't trust this place." Harper nodded, a sense of resolve washing over her. She glanced around the room, her mind racing. The house had its secrets, its dark corners where things were hidden, things that no one was meant to find. She had seen it before in the cryptic symbols on the walls, the strange sounds that echoed through the house at night. But this time it was different. She had a purpose now. She wasn't just running from the darkness anymore. She was going to face it head on. Harper's eyes fell on the staircase leading up to the second floor. She had been up there once, but she hadn't had the chance to explore every room. There were places in the house that still felt off limits, areas she hadn't dared to investigate. But that was about to change. They had to search every inch of this house if they were going to uncover whatever remained. whatever had been left behind. "Let's start upstairs," Harper said, her voice firm. "We'll search every room. Something's hidden up there. I can feel it." Ethan nodded, his expression grim. "Lead the way." They moved cautiously, stepping through the hallway toward the staircase. The house creaked and groaned as if protesting their decision to continue, but Harper refused to turn back. She wasn't afraid anymore, not like before. She knew that the only way to free herself from this place, to put an end to the nightmare that had haunted her family for generations, was to confront whatever waited in the shadows. The staircase loomed before them, its wooden steps worn from years of use. The banister was covered in a layer of dust, but there was a strange energy around it, something that made the hairs on the back of Harper's neck stand up. She hesitated for a moment, then took the first step, her foot creaking on the aged wood. Ethan followed close behind, his footsteps hesitant but determined. As they ascended, the air grew colder, and the oppressive silence that had settled over the house seemed to deepen. Each step took them further away from the safety of the first floor, deeper into the heart of the house where its secrets had been buried. Harper's pulse quickened, but she didn't stop. She couldn't afford to. Not now. They reached the second floor and found themselves standing at the top of the staircase, staring down the long hallway that stretched before them. The walls were covered in faded wallpaper, peeling in some spots, but in others, the design remained intact. The floorboards creaked beneath their feet as they moved forward, the silence of the house pressing in on them from all sides. Harper turned to her left and opened the first door they came to. It led into a room that looked like it had been abandoned for years. Dust covered everything, from the bed to the dresser to the small desk in the corner. There was a single window, its glass cracked, the curtain swaying gently in the breeze that came from somewhere deep within the house. She stepped inside, her eyes scanning the room, but nothing stood out to her. She moved to the dresser and opened the drawers one by one, finding them empty. There was nothing here, nothing that would give them the answers they were looking for. She moved on to the next room and then the next until they had searched every room on the second floor. But still, there was nothing. No clues, no hidden secrets, no answers. Harper's frustration mounted. She was certain there was something here, something she was missing. Her eyes scanned the hallway once more, her mind racing. And then it hit her, the attic. She hadn't thought to look there before, but now it seemed obvious. The attic was always the place where things were hidden, where forgotten memories and old secrets were stored. If there was any chance of finding the truth, it was up there. Without a word, Harper moved toward the door at the far end of the hall. The stairs to the attic were hidden behind it, and she could feel a strange pull drawing her toward them. The door creaked open as she stepped forward, revealing the narrow staircase leading upward. Ethan followed her closely, his breath quickening as they made their way to the top. The air grew even colder, and the shadows in the attic seemed to shift and stretch, like they were alive. Harper's hand shook as she reached for the light switch, flicking it on. The attic was filled with old boxes, trunks, and furniture draped in dusty sheets. It was dark, the light from the single bulb overhead casting long, eerie shadows across the room. But something was different here. Harper could feel it. She took a deep breath, her heart pounding in her chest as she began to move through the cluttered attic. She pushed aside a few boxes, her hands trembling as she searched for whatever it was that had been left behind. And then her eyes fell on something, a small wooden chest. It was old, its surface scratched and worn, but there was something about it, something that felt wrong, like it didn't belong. Harper moved toward it, her fingers brushing over the lid. She hesitated for a moment before opening it. Inside, there were papers, old yellowed papers covered in strange symbols and writing. Harper's breath caught in her throat as she recognized the handwriting. It was her grandmother's. She reached for the papers, unfolding them carefully. As she did, she felt a chill run down her spine. The writing was clear now, though still incomprehensible. But one word stood out. A name. Harper. It was her name, written in her grandmother's hand, and beneath it a single sentence. You are the key. As Harper held the yellowed paper in her hands, the words seemed to pulse with a strange, unnatural energy. She stared at her name, written by her grandmother, as a cold wave of realization washed over her. The house had been waiting for her all along. It had known she would come back, known that she would find this key, this final piece of the puzzle. The weight of it settled over her like a thick fog, clouding her thoughts. But one thing was clear. The battle was not over. The house had its grip on her, and it would not let go so easily. Her heart raced as she turned the paper over. But there were no more words, only silence. The attic around her seemed to hum with an unholy energy, a dark presence lingering in the corners of the room. Ethan stood behind her, his voice barely above a whisper as he asked, "What does it mean, Harper? What are we supposed to do?" Harper swallowed hard, her mind spinning. She had no answers, no clear direction, but she knew that the path ahead would not be an easy one. Whatever had been set into motion by her presence in this house could not be undone, not without great sacrifice. The darkness that had followed her family for generations was not finished yet. As she stood there in that quiet attic, Harper made a silent vow. She would uncover the truth, no matter the cost. She would face whatever this house had in store for her, and she would not be alone. Ethan would stand by her side, as they both fought to end the nightmare that had haunted them for so long. With a deep breath, Harper tucked the paper into her pocket. There was no turning back now. The house would fight. It would claw and bite. But she was ready. She would find the way to break its hold once and for all. The door to the attic creaked as it slowly swung shut behind them. The house was quiet again, but Harper knew better than to trust that silence. It was only a brief pause before the storm would come. As they made their way down the stairs, Harper glanced back at the attic door, her mind racing with questions. But there was no more time for hesitation. The end was coming, and she would be ready. Thank you all for listening to this chilling story. I hope it kept you on the edge of your seat. As the darkness settles in, and you drift off to sleep tonight, may your dreams be filled with peace and tranquility, away from the horrors that haunt the walls of that cursed house. Remember to subscribe so you never miss another thrilling tale. Stay tuned for more spine-tingling stories, and until next time, sweet dreams if you dare. Good night.